In this video, speaking on behalf of Statesman Debate Institute, I'm going to arm you, the public forum debater, with powerful arguments, most probably not available elsewhere. I'm going to give you the element of surprise if you follow along. Specifically, this is a classical topic analysis of the September-October 2025 Public Forum Debate Resolution, which reads, Resolved, the United Kingdom should rejoin the European Union. Hello, I'm Dr. Joseph Arminio, SDI's senior instructor and also founder of the Institute. We're now in our 10th year. We did take a hiatus from 2021 up until recently. In fact, we've been rather busy publishing all manner of books, many of which come to bear on anything you're going to be doing in the forensic circuit, and in particular on this debate resolution, the September-October 2025 Public Forum Debate Resolution. Now, speaking of this resolution, I find it to be problematical. Now, my colleagues who deliver what I call conventional topic analysis will tell you that the resolution tilts toward the affirmative. I don't believe this for a moment. I believe it tilts very heavily toward the negative. This is not to say there aren't good arguments that the affirmative can use, but if you'll follow along, I think you'll find the negative has a crushing advantage in this contest. The imbalance of this debate resolution aside, this is an extraordinary debate resolution. I mean extraordinary in terms of what you're going to learn about the world. Not just European affairs, but the entire world. So I welcome this resolution. And because of this extraordinary nature of this debate resolution, because it requires you to know so much information, or potentially points you to so many amazing discoveries, I feel compelled to provide a long analysis. It's approximately 2 hours long. I've also felt compelled to provide you with an evidence package for this resolution, and also to provide coaching to help you apply and build upon this evidence package. And here you see on the left of this slide is a partial snapshot of our catalog of programs, which you can find at the URL cfar21.org/SDI programs. I'll have more to say about this catalog at the very end of this video. But this is quite the undertaking. Don't just think about how you can win at this event, but what you can learn about this issue. What are the components of this classical topic analysis? If you will, what is its table of contents? Well, on this slide, I'm going to give you a breakdown. And pay close attention. I'd recommend you would take notes. You see up here a lot of numbers. Those correspond to minutes or parts of minutes that are devoted to a particular component of this classical topic analysis. So you'll be able to go back and use this slide, this table of contents, as a guide for the entire effort, this entire analysis. So the first thing to look at is I'm mentioning that this topic analysis divides into 18 slides. We're on now the 4th slide. And here on the right, you can see I've given you indications. First slide, second slide, and third slide. This is how many minutes each of these slides is taken. So now let's focus upon the bulk of this analysis, which is the remaining 15 slides. So the first thing we're going to see is the very next slide. We're going to spend 4.5 minutes, and we're going to look at 3 deficiencies, which I think we can discern in conventional topic analyses. You're going to get a sense of how much different, and I hope and I think better, this classical topic analysis is, or at least where it leads you in some novel directions, or probably does. And those 3 deficiencies we're going to delve into at greater length as the analysis rolls on.
Well, then for the next 5 minutes, we're going to orient ourselves on the map. We're going to take a look at this debate resolution in a spatial sense. Then we're going to take a look at the debate resolution in a temporal sense, take a look at the chronology. And here you're going to find some discoveries, your first startling encounters, in fact, with unusual history that maybe you're not being told about in the conventional topic analyses. And we're also going to account for why you're running into what may well be novel information, that the perspectives that we're typically sharing on the conventional forensic circuit are only part of or only one set of perspectives that could be shared. Now you see here I have these dotted lines. Well, now we're plunging into the deficiencies. So here we're the first major slides, 11 minutes and 14 and a half. Here I'm going to lay out what you would think is a conventional topic analysis. Here's arguments for the affirmative. That would be the 11-minute slide, and then arguments for the negative, the 14.5-minute slide. But as we go into the negative, you're going to start seeing things I think you're not encountering elsewhere. You're now running into what I discern as the first deficiency in conventional analyses of this debate resolution. Once that is done, we're now going to get the big picture. We're going to pull the camera back some, and we're going to see the big picture from the affirmative point of view. That would be 3 minutes, and the big picture from the negative point of view, that's 5 minutes. Then we go into this interesting stretch, very long slide, the longest of all the slides, that I entitle primary sources. And you're going to see how I'm going to use primary sources. This is information without interpretation, and then I'm going to start drawing connections. And at some point the primary sources seem to tilt toward the affirmative. Then they seem to, then another look at these primary sources, they seem to tilt toward the negative. And then back to the affirmative, back to the negative. When we're finally done, it seems to tilt toward the negative, if I'm handling the primary sources in an honest fashion. It seems to tilt toward the negative. Now, so far, we've talked about, in terms of deficiencies, the first deficiency. Well, now let me take you to the right-hand side here. And this block here, these 3 slides, we're going to be looking at the second deficiency that I think we can discern in conventional perspectives where this debate resolution is concerned. And you're going to be rather startled, I think, when you take a look at this set of slides. Some of this information here is metaphorical, some symbols associated with the European Union. Some of it has to do with important treaty. Some of it has to do with important history. So here is our second deficiencies in the typical analyses of this debate resolution. Now we come to the third deficiency that I think we can discern in the conventional topic analyses of the UK-EU debate resolution, and it's going to span 9 minutes. When that is done, we'll take you into the review, and you'll encounter this metaphor I use of the mountaintop, how you can ascend the mountaintop of knowledge. When you're up in that mountaintop, you have a strategic advantage. You can secure for your team the element of surprise, and you're going to learn things about world affairs that you might never otherwise learn, even going way beyond what you're finding typically in your textbooks, your history or world history textbooks. And then we go back again and show you some more about the offerings of Statesman Debate Institute. And remember the importance of this evidence package and of coaching we offer, which applies the evidence package, and coaching which can be of value to your on-site or in-house debate coach, and even to your other social science teachers, which we offer for them. So let them know there's something for you, there's something for your coaches, and something for your other teachers. Something that Statesman Debate Institute offers. All right, let's now get started with the heart of this analysis. I fear that the typical topic analysis being offered to public forum debaters this tournament cycle, and for that matter, the rest of the season and beyond,
suffers from globalist myopia, tending to miss the populist perspective. Now, this concept of globalist myopia, what do I mean? There is a tendency, I think perhaps unwitting, for topic analyses, even many debate coaches, to present a globalist perspective and nothing else. Not because they're doing it because they support the globalist agenda per se, they don't know perhaps other alternatives. And that great alternative is the populist perspective. There is a movement afoot, it's been going on a long time, to build up support for the elimination of the nation-state system and the creation, ultimately, of regional blocs and then world government. Well, this tendency is these support for global government has accelerated, and even more, moving at even a faster speed. What is missing is, I could have used the word nationalist, I prefer not to. I want to use the word populist. What is missing is this populist perspective. And what is that? This is the point of view of the family, of the citizen. Not the elite, but the citizen. The rank and file, the fellow who goes about his day responsibly running his business, working for a business, raising a family, being part of a family. This populist perspective, popular, what is the people's perspective, is more and more being lost in political discourse in this country and around the globe. Now, what is interesting is that the debate resolution at hand, UK should rejoin EU, brings us really to the epicenter, to the origin of all this globalist arguments, and where the populist perspective is being rubbed out or has been rubbed out. But now there's a backlash. We hear about the alternative right in many European countries, and no wonder. Now, I'm not saying that the globalist perspective or the globalist approach is better or worse than the populist position. I'm just letting you know that you have these clash of perspectives. And here it is very manifest in the debate resolution of September, October 2025. Because the globalist perspective tends to rule the day in the forensic circuit, analyses tend to miss three big things. So I've indicated here these three big deficiencies. So the first deficiency, that conventional topic analysis is inadequate within the very parameters that it confines itself to. So it doesn't look at all the evidence, it looks at a subset of the evidence, and even that is wanting within this narrow or more narrow or tighter circle of evidence. A second deficiency, it doesn't go far enough back in history, and this is really quite extraordinary. Among other things, it misses significant evidence of Soviet and Nazi, and look at the word I use, ongoing influences. There is strong evidence to indicate that the Nazi and Soviet forces are still shaping the Europeans, in particular the European Union. And the third deficiency, it neglects immensely relevant information about national and international money powers. What do I mean by money powers? The folks who own central banks around the world. So you have these three deficiencies. And the upshot of this is that I think we have when applied to the September-October 2025 Public Forum debate resolution, we have a strong tilt toward the negative, or at least I think we do. So here you see a map of Europe. Well, now before we discuss the arguments affirmative and negative, talk about globalist perspectives and populist perspectives and all the rest of the arguments and evidence, let's take a closer look at the wording of the September-October 2025 debate resolution. UK should rejoin EU. Now notice what it says here. It doesn't say will join or has left and so forth. It's saying should join. Be very careful of that verb, should. And what is the UK and what is the EU and what does it mean to rejoin? All these things have to be parsed. Now, in the case of the UK, so here we have the map. We can see that the United Kingdom, I think we're pretty familiar with that. Here it is. I'm pointing to it. It consists of 3 elements: England, Scotland, and Wales. Then you also have Northern Ireland. Keep in mind these four parts. Especially keep in mind England per se, which is closest to the continent, Scotland, the farthest away, and Northern Ireland. You'll see why these will be significant in a moment. So it should rejoin what? Well, here in the map, the European Union is depicted by blue and by yellow marked countries. So any countries on the map that are blue are members of the European Union. 27 countries presently. England had been. Now it's a part. It also consists of countries that are yellow: Ireland, Austria, and Cyprus. Now, what are these the countries depicted by black? Well, these countries are members of NATO, North American Treaty Organization, and NATO includes the United States. These countries in black are not members of the European Union. They're members of a military alliance. Now we're starting to talk about what is the European Union, what is it like and what is it not like. So the European Union is a political economic coalition of sovereign states under a very peculiar leadership, which we'll get to eventually. NATO is a union or a membership of sovereign countries. There's a difference here. In the case of Europe, or the European Union, there is a European Commission, unelected, and they are the ones who recommend laws, or propose laws, and then the European Parliament votes upon them. This is a very much top-down and tending toward the authoritarian side. So the top of the European Union is unelected. Now, NATO is different. The sovereign countries have governments, leadership that consist of elected officials. This is a big difference between the two. So here we see that England, because it's also in black, or I should say United Kingdom, because it's also in black, is a member of NATO, but not a member of the European Union. And let's look around the rest of this map. We notice these countries that are in gray. So here I've got the marker right now, the laser pointing toward Russian Federation, Ukraine. Remember, we have a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, Belarus, and so forth. We also have North Africa. We have a good part of the Middle East. Now, something that jumps out at you, we have NATO, including, I'm now pointing at Turkey. Remember, countries in black on this map are members of NATO, but not members of the EU. So the countries in blue are members of both the EU and NATO. Austria, just a member of the EU. Switzerland, by the way, interesting. In the midst of Europe, not a member of anything. Not a member of NATO, not a member of the European Union. And what else about Switzerland? Very powerful financial interests are centered in Switzerland. So much for the map. Let's now take the next step and start looking at arguments, affirmative and negative. If you were paying attention to the last few words I uttered in the previous slide, you'll be startled by this slide. Didn't I just say in the end of my remarks of the previous slide, we'll now turn to arguments related to this debate resolution, UK rejoin EU? Well, you look at this slide and what do you see? I see a map and I see a chronology. Where are the arguments? I'm trying to make a point here. Arguments can be narration. They can be involved, they can be related to narrative, to the chronology, to the flow of events. Now let's take a closer look at the slide itself. So here on the left we see a close-up of England and Ireland. Let me get my pointer going. So here is England in white. Here is Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. This is all the UK. These four elements, these four places or parts are part of the UK, and here is Ireland. Now, Ireland is part of the European Union, and it shares a border with the UK, and yet the UK is not a part of the European Union. Now, why is this relevant? Well, for one reason, that there's been a movement in Scotland to rejoin the EU, whether England, that part of UK called England, wants to rejoin it or not. And also, the UK must, because of the new terms, because after they've left the European Union, they now had to, they're into a new arrangement with the European Union. They have to send their goods to the European Union through Ireland. So it's a bit roundabout, and they pass across the Northern Ireland border. That may be a factor in this upcoming debate. Now let's take a look at the right-hand side. Here's this chronology. And remember, there may be arguments lurking or embedded in the chronology. And so I've divided the chronology into yellow and white entries. I did that for a very important reason. The yellow entries I offer you as part of a classically based topic analysis. I haven't seen these in other analyses, which I'm calling conventional topic analysis. It's not to say that they might pop up, but so far I haven't seen them. And why is that? Well, for one reason, the globalist perspective is going to tend to ignore things related to these yellow entries, and it's going to tend to emphasize things related to the white entries. So let's take a closer look. So notice here that the chronology begins in 1942. That's a long way back, isn't it? I thought that we're talking about the UK rejoining the European Union. So when is that? Well, 2025. Not even on the chronology, not on the chart. But I'm taking you all the way back to 1942. And what's going on then? Well, World War II is at its height. So that's interesting in itself. So let's now go through this one by one. So in 1942, I tell you that the Nazi International is advancing this project called Atlantic to the Urals. Now, at that time, the Nazi Reich is ascended across the continent of Europe. Remember, England is remaining defiant and has not been conquered. The Battle of Britain has been come and gone, and the British have won the Battle of Britain. And the Nazis have turned their attention to invading the Soviet Union. Well, in 1942, the Nazis are not quite sure, war being what it is, being unpredictable, not quite sure if they're going to win or lose. They make plans if they win, and they also, the Nazi leadership makes plans if they lose the war militarily. Keep this in mind. And so as the war progresses, as we go beyond 1942, 1943, 44, and 45, now they can see they're going to lose. So what happens? The Nazi Party makes plans for the future. This is all documented. When I say the party, there's a difference between the state and the party. And we're going to see that also when we get closer to our own time. We talk about the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So the Nazi Party may find that its vessel, the Nazi state, will lose, but perhaps the party can live on. And that's exactly what they attempt to do, to perpetuate the fortunes of the party, even if the state is lost, and then come back again and revive a party-controlled state. So that's something important that's going on. And I'll have more to say about the Nazi International. So now we're talking about the Nazi Party leaving its German moorings and now moving about the globe. Now we come back to what we consider conventional history, 1945, 1955. The UK is part of the occupation of Germany. The United Kingdom, France, the United States will occupy the western section. The Soviets will occupy what will become East Germany. Now, during this time, the UK doesn't want to have any part to do with things on the continent, any organizations on the continent. Why? Because the Brits are concerned that there will be a tendency for the Europeans to promote German interest. Even though the Germans have lost, they're concerned about a revived Germany and not wanting to be tethered to that, to be ultimately subordinated to that. Secondly, they still have the British Empire. They want to keep their focus global. Yes, Europe to a great degree, but also to maintain their relationship with their other elements of the empire. And they believe that their future, their economic, political future, cultural future, still resides within the empire. Well, in 1949, NATO was formed. Now, this is that military alliance we spoke of a moment ago, referring to the previous slide. Why? Because, well, the Soviet Union, growing intransigent, wanting to hang on to its conquest in Eastern Europe, needs to be opposed. So a military alliance is formed. UK joins that, and that is a smooth transition. It's been occupying Nazi Germany, the defeated Germany. That's a smooth transition for the UK, but they're still not part of anything beyond a military alliance. Now, in 1951, what is formed there? The European Coal and Steel Community. And this is just very small membership, about a half a dozen countries, France, Germany especially, promoting coal and steel production. UK is not part of this. Then in 1973, the United Kingdom comes in and joins what has now become the European Community. The European Community consists of the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community, and also consists of the Council of Europe, which are a circle of leaders of all the countries. And there's also the beginnings of a custom union. And so they join this custom union and these two other elements. It's called now the European Community. Now, I haven't put on the chronology here, but something very important happens in 1975. The UK Parliament agrees to join the European Union. Well, what about the population as a whole? Well, they submit the decision to join the European Community. They submit that to a referendum to the people. And the people vote for this joining of UK to Europe by a vote of 2-1, 67% in favor and about 33% opposed. So it's a very, very big majority in support of rejoining, as opposed to the row that took place within the House of Commons, whether they should join or not. There were a lot of folks who still didn't want to join back in 1973, but the people as a whole of the UK want in. This isn't the European Union, not yet. This consists of a few more countries than they had back in 1951. Now, what do I have again? Now we have another yellow entry. Be on alert. This again is not conventional. What's happening in 1989? Well, everybody tells us that the Soviet Union collapsed, but did it? Remember I talked to you about the Nazis and the Nazi International. Make a distinction in your mind between a revolutionary party and the state that it controls, or if you will, between the parasite and the host. So an argument can be made. There's evidence to be seen showing that the Nazi Party lived on after 1945. There's also evidence that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, outlived the Soviet Union. Not only did it outlive it, it actually removed, this is all deliberate policy, removed the image of the enemy while the enemy remained. That in other words, there is in fact strong primary sources, and we can also see by movements on the ground that the Soviet Party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, deliberately dismantled the empire, the Soviet Union, in order to fool the West, in order to continue to advance their project of Atlantic to Vladivostok, that's what they called it, and to continue the world revolution, so another term that they use. Now I want to go into this evidence saying that the Communist Party deliberately dismantled the Soviet Union and talk about how the Communist Party has lived on at a later point in this analysis. Just be aware of it. There is strong evidence that suggests that this really happened. Yet you see I'm asking the question. Notice the difference here. Here I'm using a declarative sentence, Nazi International advances their project. And here I'm saying, no, I'm not quite sure. Now, why do I use a question mark here in the case of the CPSU and what happened in 1989. Well, that's because the majority of people will say this is nonsense. When the Soviet Union went out of business, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union went out of business. Oh, there may have been a few hangers-on to the communist cause, but they've lost their host, their nation state, in fact, their territory, their empire. They're done. But were they? So now we come to 1992. Now here we have the formation of the European Union. And at that time it was called the Treaty of the EU, the Treaty of the European Union, or United States of Europe, as Winston Churchill liked to refer to it. And this creation of the European Union includes European Union central banks, and it includes a economic monetary unit, that is to say, a common currency called the euro, the EMU. The UK makes a distinction. It's going to join the European Union, mostly, but it's not going to be part of this element called the EMU. It's not going to accept the euro. It's going to keep the British pound apart. So notice here, the UK, if you look at the history from 1945 on, you see that the UK, step by step, is heading closer and closer toward European-wide integration, but still holds back to some degree. So even at the birth of the European Union, which the UK joins, the UK is still holding back to some degree. Then in 2016, so they stay in the European Union. In 2016, they vote to get out of the European Union. It's called Brexit. And by 2021, the United Kingdom is gone altogether. And so here we are now, 2025, and there has been talk in the UK of rejoining, and perhaps we made a mistake, we should come back in. So here is your essential chronology. On this slide, you see I've listed 7 arguments that the affirmative can use, and with great effect. You're going to find that I've got the same list of arguments on the negative, on the next slide. Now, before we go any further, let's go back again and think about this debate resolution, the actual wording. UK should rejoin EU. So what are we saying here? Well, what we're saying is that it's beneficial to the UK to rejoin. Now, beneficial could be that rejoining is all advantageous. You can't think of any disadvantages, or that it's or the negative would argue it's totally disadvantageous, or, as is typically the case, especially when we're dealing with a continent and hundreds of millions of people and many countries, it's more likely that either we're looking at a net benefit to UK to join or a net loss for UK to rejoin. Keep that in mind. That, in other words, there are some good things that will come from joining and some bad things that will come from joining, but really what matters is the summation of the good and the bad. Keep that in mind. And to win this debate, you might lose a lot of ground. You may say you're on the affirmative. You'll say, well, there's a lot of that they should rejoin, but in fact the negative will score a lot of points against you. They'll be able to show a lot of disadvantages if you rejoin. But if you can show that there are more advantages to joining, you'll win the debate. Keep that in mind. Now, as we take a closer look now at the affirmative, what do we see? So, and as we plunge into this slide and the next slide, I'm going to pretty much confine myself to the arguments that the conventional topic analysis touches upon. And yet I'm saying to you, I told you back in the beginning of this analysis, that the conventional topic analysis is wanting. Even within its own parameters, it's missing evidence. We'll see why shortly. So let's look at the affirmative. So the first thing we see is that there are arguments in regard to security. Maintaining the peace, keeping yourself safe from conquest or from infiltration of one kind or another. And when we talk about security, we have a lot to think about. So we might be concerned about the threat from Russia. We might be concerned by the threat from the Middle East. from China, from any other source. We might be concerned about cyber attacks, but usually we're thinking about military power, military threats. And so if the UK rejoins the European Union, that would seem to strengthen Europe vis-a-vis Russia. Russia had invaded the Ukraine in 2022. Both Russia and Ukraine are not part of the European Union nor of NATO. So you would say, well, it's out of region, it's out of Europe per se, but it's on the doorstep of Europe. So that war is relevant. And in joining or rejoining the EU, the UK would be somehow strengthening the EU, and that would therefore strengthen Europe vis-a-vis Russia in this conflict, and allowing Europe to help Ukraine. So that's an argument that the affirmative can use. How about on the economic side? Well, on the economic side, you'll typically hear coaches say, well, my God, the arguments are clearly in favor of rejoining. And I have to say myself, when I've looked at analyses, so we want to look at, let me draw you a little timeline here. We want to look at narration, period of time, or chronology. And I'm going to draw these lines here. So this is in 2016, when the British decide they want to leave. They vote to leave. There's a referendum. And this is in 2021, when they finally do leave. So if you look at the economics of the situation, you'll say, well, what happened to the UK's economy after it left? So this period here, but also you may want to consider when it begins to decide to leave. And what you find is there's a lot of arguments saying that it was a bad thing for the UK to leave. A lot of indicators. First thing I've seen is in terms of what effect did it have on the economy as a whole, on the UK economy as a whole. And I've seen estimates anywhere between a loss of 2% of GDP to a decline as high as 6% of GDP. You see that the UK per capita, measured by GDP or PPP, and that's something else to keep in mind by the difference between GDP and PPP. So gross domestic product and PPP, which is purchasing power parity. If you look at those two differences, again, you'll see, well, there's been a stagnation more or less since they left. But you also see that the decision to leave began to affect UK's economic health. So it began to affect foreign direct investment, that is, money that other countries are willing to give to the UK economy, because they think, well, if the UK is now going to leave, why invest in the UK? So we're talking about financial investment in the UK. That also has suffered. So there are quite a few arguments that do favor the affirmative. And there's some very good arguments being put forth in conventional topic analyses. No question about that. Now, some other reasons to rejoin have to do with climate. We've heard perhaps of the Paris Climate Accord. So there's this belief that the Earth is overheating, and if the UK will rejoin the EU, then it can strengthen environmental policy, strengthen its environment, be part of a bigger effort to prevent the overheating of the Earth. What about health? Another important indicator here of why the UK should rejoin the EU. Get my marker going. So we discussed so far security, economic, climate arguments, and health. Well, what happened in 2020? We had this pandemic. there's the World Health Organization. It's a UN organization. Well, the EU is a very important member of the WHO. And by the way, they're pushing something called One Health, the idea that there will be a global medical organization which would better position us to deal with future diseases, outbreaks, viruses, turning into epidemics or pandemics, as Affirmative will argue happened in 2020. So it's a good idea for the UK to join the European Union, because the European Union is a very big part of this global health effort. Cultural and social. If you join the European Union, there's a better interaction between the peoples of Europe and the UK, and that enriches your culture, and people can move about more easily. Research and education. Again, the European Union has more money at its disposal than the UK, much more. And so it's a benefit, they would say, the Affirmative would say, to join the European Union. And what are some of those particular programs? Well, two particular programs come to mind. One of them is called Erasmus. This is a student exchange program that the EU maintains. It funds the swapping or the exchange of students one country to another. And the other is called Horizon, and this has to do with scientific research, and the European Union funds that. So these are all benefits to the UK to rejoin that they're not enjoying right now by being a part. And then what about public opinion and parties? Well, you may recall that I said back in 1975 that the vote in the UK to join the European community was 2-1 in favor. When we came down to 2016, the vote to leave was very close. I think it was 52-48. It was a very close vote. But it did swing in favor of Brexit, of pulling out. Well, now in 2021, it seems that 50% or higher are having remorse about leaving. They want to rejoin. So the Affirmative can say, well, it looks as if the people of the UK are coming back to their senses. They're returning to the overwhelming support for the EU or for the European institutions of the last 50 years. That this vote in 2016 was an aberration. So you have these 7 arguments, and they lead to some very powerful claims indeed, favoring the Affirmative. Now here's the negative arguments. You notice they're a mirror image of the Affirmative. But how good are they compared to the arguments that the Affirmative can use? Well, the sense is across the forensic circuit, the public forum portion of the forensic circuit, that the arguments tilt toward the Affirmative. But why is that? Well, that's because of this globalist perspective, especially in case of the climate and the health arguments. So let's slow down though for a minute and take a closer look. So security. Well, Affirmative can argue that the UK should rejoin the EU if you believe Russia was the aggressor, if it was Russia's fault for this Russo-Ukraine war. But is it Russia's fault? If you take a closer look at the events on the ground, you might see that perhaps Ukraine bears a lot of responsibility for Russia's move. This is on the doorstep of Russia, this war. There's been a provocation, in a sense, right in front of the face of the bear, the Russian bear, and they reacted appropriately to defend their interests. NATO expanded eastward toward Russia. A lot of arguments can be marshaled. Now, if you have a globalist perspective you're going to tend to be on the side of Ukraine in the Russo-Ukraine war. So there is a prejudice, maybe it's for good reasons, but there's a prejudice in favor of that. Be very aware of that when you plunge into this discussion. It's difficult to find arguments that say Russia is not the aggressor. There's also arguments to be made, it really doesn't matter whether Russia wins or loses. So there's some powerful arguments here. Now, I've heard conventional topic analyses say that the negative has to be creative. Well, yes, it does, because in this milieu where we're tending to take globalist positions, tending to be reading the press, which is reading academic reports, think tank reports that tend to be globalistic, it's more difficult to find arguments favoring the negative, but they're out there. And that's what I'm trying to show you, that this populist approach, if you see things not from the point of view of the global elite, but see things from the point of view of the common man and woman, you begin to see that there may be some different points of view here, and you can gather evidence together. So there's a very big one with the Russo-Ukraine war. Now, how about on the economic side? Well, I told you, yes, if you look at a lot of the indicators, the UK has not done well since Brexit was agreed upon in 2016, especially since it was acted upon in 2021. One of those areas is in the area of tariffs. I didn't mention that with the previous slide, but that's something the negative, or the affirmative can use very effectively to a point. Let's take a closer look at the effect of Brexit on tariffs and on the flow of goods and services. Well, what we notice is with the data that UK exports of goods have suffered since Brexit. We notice, though, that the export of services has actually increased, but that the net loss is a general net loss in terms of UK's trade balance. But let's look specifically, though, at the arrangements here. So now we have a situation, well, prior to Brexit, where it was a customs union. There was no tariff barriers between the UK and the other members of the European Union. Now there are. But then an arrangement was made between the UK and the EU, removing those tariff barriers. But what has happened, though, is there's more red tape in order to sell goods and services to the European Union members. And you have to send your goods through Ireland, this roundabout trip, and then they're brought into the continent of Europe. So what you've noticed, a couple of things come from this development. On the one hand, you can be apart from the European Union, and yet you can still enter into special relationships between the UK and the members of the European Union, or even the European Union as a whole, which is what the UK did. And in some sense, you can mitigate the consequences, the negative consequences of Brexit. Keep that in mind as the negative. And even for the affirmative, you've got to be ready for the negative using these arguments. But there's something also on the economic and on the security side that you're not going to hear so much from the globalist perspective. It takes us back to the Russo-Ukraine war. There is this view that Russia is the aggressor. But if you step back and look at the world economy, and you now look at the G7, so this is the top 7 countries, which includes the UK, and then you look at that compared to BRICS. What are BRICS? This is a collection of non-G7 countries. So the G7 led by the US, you have the UK, France, you have Japan, Italy. These countries are in one block. You have the BRICS in another. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they have other countries joining too now. The BRICS had been second fiddle to the G7. Well, if you look at what has been happening in terms of economic power, you're going to see that the BRICS, which had been behindhand compared to the G7 have now pulled even and are projected to pull ahead. And the G7 countries are falling. That would include the European Union. What is happening here at this inflection point, or this crossing over? Because of the Russia-Ukraine war, there has been consequences around the globe. The United States has led this coalition against Russia, and it is enforcing sanctions against Russia. And it is not only sanctioning Russia for its involvement in the Russo-Ukraine war, but it's sanctioning those who trade with Russia, for instance, India. And this is resulting in a backlash against the United States and its allies and against the G7. And what is happening is that the BRICS economy as a whole are pulling now equal and now are projected to pull ahead of America and its allies, the G7. So, UK wants to rejoin the EU. The EU believes that Russia is the aggressor. The EU takes the US position here. The EU therefore, the UK therefore is contributing to this decline in the G7, in what we call the West. And the global South, including Russia, is benefiting in the long term from the war. Negative can find some very powerful arguments in its favor. So now let's take a look at climate and health. And I bring the two of them up together for a reason. There is a very heavy prejudice in favor of this position. Global warming is happening. The emission of carbon dioxide is warming up, overheating the earth. And it's related also to the argument about health, about the need to form a global response, a global health organization to deal with upcoming pandemics. So what you're seeing is that the affirmative can argue that the earth is overheating, and this in turn is causing health problems. So you'll hear the argument as the human population spreads, that it's crowding out animal and fish populations, and therefore humans are now becoming in contact with the non-human life more frequently than ever, and that diseases which up until now had only been confined to the animal and fish world are now jumping over and affecting the human. And we heard a lot about this in 2020. We heard that the virus, they say, had come out of China. Why? Well, there was a fear that it had come out of bat soup, that the Chinese were eating a lot of bat and that the bat had viruses, and now this was being brought over to the human population and spread around the world, and that we're going to see more of this. And that's why the strong argument why the affirmative will say the UK should rejoin the EU, because the EU is at the forefront of this effort to form a global preparation and global response to the spreading health crisis. But is that happening? Is that happening? And I say to you, there is very compelling evidence, primary source evidence and secondary source evidence, that shows us that this climate argument is nonsense and that we are not facing the problems that the globalists say we are facing on the health front as well. And so we see that there is not overheating taking place, and the human population is not pressing so hard against the rest of the world, against the rest of life on the planet, that it's causing a backlash that is hurting human health. And there are very strong arguments that say this is nonsense. And so if the negative will go looking for these arguments, they will have a powerful argument in their favor, arguing against the UK joining the EU. Because remember, the EU believes in the propositions that there is a global climate crisis, that there is a global health crisis, and that we have to form an organization of all countries, and we have to subordinate our sovereignty and independence to do that. There are very strong arguments against that. This is what I would say the populist position, by and large being overlooked in our forensic circuit. Now, what about the cultural and social aspects here? talked about programs such as Horizon and Erasmus, and these are available to the members of the European Union, but apparently not to the UK. Well, remember though that the closer you come together, sometimes the more difficult it can be to get along. And remember that the European Union is driving a lot of the cultural and social changes in Europe. And maybe these are not all for the good. One of the interesting things we see is this farmers' protest, which is breaking out all over Europe in response to EU policies. Something is amiss here. Well, I have more to say about the cultural and social implications in a way that benefits the negative later on in the video. So we also have discussed research and education. Let's jump down here to when we discussed culture and social. These are all related. Now let's take a look at political opinion and parties. Remember I said to you before that approximately 55% now of members of the UK are regretting Brexit. Well, if we take a closer look at the polls, we see that that's true, but we also see that the number of people who think Brexit is a problem is really not that large. I've seen polls that say only 10% of the population thinks that Brexit's an issue, a major issue. Oh yes, they wish they hadn't left, but compared to other problems, it's not that important. We also see that there really is very little support among the major parties, the Conservative and Labour parties in England, to return. That negotiations would be quite complicated if they returned. What's also rather interesting is the process itself of returning. So, do you think the European Union would welcome back the UK? Well, you might think they would, but are you sure? Are they sure that the UK might not change its mind again? And so what might the UK have to do to reassure the EU that it really wants back in? Well, it's not just enough to have Parliament say we want to come back in. There probably has to be a referendum. And that referendum might have to be first a two-part referendum. One, we do want to come back in, and two, we want to come back in on the terms that Parliament has said we should come back in on. There's a lot involved, very complex process. And also, negative can argue that the UK can strike deals with the European Union without coming back into the European Union. That in a sense, though, the UK is still part of Europe. It's still part of NATO. In fact, when the UK Parliament decided to go, they kept saying, we've left the EU, but we've not left Europe. So this is a fertile ground that the negative can work, generating arguments in its favor. So now it's time to talk about the big picture. Let's pull the camera back and get a higher level view of the arguments. And so right now, what I'm suggesting to you is that the globalist view would say that the affirmative wins this debate. The globalist view is that all problems require a global technocratic response. So we need to band countries together to solve these problems. We talked about climate, we talked about health, security, dealing with aggressors like Russia. But also we need a technocratic response, that the world's becoming so complex that elected officials can't keep up, and that you need philosopher kings, wise men to rule. And that's exactly where the European Union comes in, because the European Union is led by that European Commission. These are unelected officials. These are technocrats who make decisions on behalf of other people who cannot both be recalled by the electorate. And that's exactly what we need. Whereas the UK, which is still a sovereign country, elects its top leaders and all the leaders below that too. And then those elected leaders appoint technocrats to rule. Whereas in the European Union, it's the other way around, at least at the top. The European Parliament doesn't initiate laws. They rubber stamp laws. They vote for or against a law. But the law is the idea of doing this, doing that. That comes from unelected officials at the top. But that's exactly what we need. And so you see now that the affirmative can argue that this is why we need the European Union, because the European Union is a very strong element of the United Nations Environmental Program, a very strong member of the World Health Organization, promoting free trade, so the movement of goods and services across the globe and people, migration across the globe, benefits the world economy. And the more we integrate countries, the less countries have sovereign independent options, the better for people as a whole. The world's very complex now. Very important for forming alliances, military alliances. And so they'll say to you that the European Union is a positive step toward global government. That's at the root of the affirmative position. And here is tremendous evidence in their favor. Let's just take climate. Well, we know that 77% of EU residents believe global warming is a dire threat and calls for very severe policy, the rollback of fossil fuel use, that we've got to cut down that carbon dioxide being emitted by fossil fuel industries. Let's turn now to the negative big picture view. So here's the slide dealing with the big picture from the negative point of view. And this means we're looking at the nation-state view and this populist view. And what they say is the globalists are fomenting most of the problems we face. And not only that, that they're the globalists, of which the European Union is the most outstanding of all international organizations, is imposing a reprobate common mind. And that common mind is taking us down, not up. Specifically, the European Union is the enemy of its member states. Now, I'm really driving this home now. So in the conventional analysis, you're not likely to see it go to this extreme that the EU is the enemy of its member states. They would argue this might be an extreme position. Or is it? So what I'm saying to you is if you go into your typical topic analysis, if you don't deal with Statesman Debate Institute for that matter, maybe there are a few other institutes that do what we do, but if you look at the typical coaching you're getting around the league, they're going to argue on the margins without telling you that. They're going to be in favor of the globalist view without declaring it openly. They're going to say, see all these arguments tilting toward the affirmative, and you're scrambling as the negative to counteract them. That's why, because you're not hitting the root of the matter, going to the strongest argument in your favor, which is that the EU is the enemy of its member states. Now let's take a closer look at why this proposition might be true. EU is the enemy of its member states. Well, look at, by definition, that European Commission again. The very thing that the affirmative says is advantageous, that you have unelected technocrats running the European Union, is the very problem the negative can argue. That they're out of touch with the common man. They're out of touch with this populist view. They're promoting some global tyrannical project or global misguided mad project. And now I'm going to suggest to you that now there could be a cause for this, and that is Nazi and Soviet influences and more. There may be a reason why the EU could be the enemy of its member states. Maybe because it was baked in the cake. Maybe because the origin of the European Union is rotten from the beginning. We'll get to more of that later. What is one of the effects? Well, I referred already to the farmers' revolt. You should get video footage of this farmers' revolt. And there's quite a few videos out there that'll show you irate farmers driving up to European Union buildings, offices, and dumping manure by the tons on the buildings, on the doors, on the windows, and forcing the European officials to clean out this manure. You heard that right, manure. Why haven't you heard about this? Because the mainstream press isn't covering it. Well, why not? It seems rather startling, don't you? Don't you think it's worth a look? Why do you only hear about these or only find these videos in fringe alternative media outlets? Why? I would suggest because there is a commonality here among the press. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, you, the debater, have to decide. But it's more difficult to find arguments in favor of this root or deeper negative argument than it is to find arguments in favor of the globalist view or to find arguments of the negative that only work the margins of the evidence. And now we're going to talk in a moment about this comparison, the Treaty of Lisbon of 2007 versus the American States Constitution circa 1776. If you look at the actual European Union's own language, I think you're going to see that something just might be amiss. In other words, that the European Union, we'll see this in a moment, the European Union almost condemns itself by its own words. So this talk about 77% of the European Union residents believing climate change is happening, that global warming is happening, is a hoax. Why? Because they have been, the population has been indoctrinated over time to think there is this global warming crisis when there is no crisis, when in fact it is the very technocrats and the globalist view which has resulted in most people being led astray. So this big picture view for the negative is something you're not going to typically find, I think, elsewhere in the other topic analyses. I'm calling this the primary sources file, and I'm going to be looking at population and purchasing power parity. I'm going to use this data, primary source data, in a way that will ultimately tilt toward the negative. And I think, in fact, even points toward the advantage that the negative has in this debate. But let's get started. So I'm looking at a number of political jurisdictions, and we'll be looking at population as expressed by millions. That's what the M stands for in all these entries. And we're looking at purchasing power parity as recorded by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Another international financial organization, the World Bank, has a somewhat different set of numbers. They're close. And others have different numbers too. Of course, there's also the GDP, the gross domestic product. You're going to notice that the PPP is expressed in US dollars. There's your US dollar sign. But there's a distinction between, we should draw a distinction between the GDP and the PPP. So I've said before, both the GDP and the PPP are snapshots of an economy's strength at any particular time. It could be a day, a month, a year. It's typically either, or a quarter. It's typically for a year. These shots are for a year. We talk about GDP. Well, we're using the US dollar and the US economy as the measuring stick. People use dollars around the world, and then we determine what their economic strength is in the context of the US dollar, GDP. But that may not be fair to some countries. In fact, it isn't, because these other countries may have different currencies. The European Union has its euro, the UK has its pound, there's the yen, the ruble for Russia, and so forth. When we look at the measurement of the economic strength of a country in terms of dollars, we might miss the mark. So we turn toward a adjustment. We relate the dollar to that particular political entity's own currency. And now we're much closer to understanding the economic strength of that particular jurisdiction. So that's what the IMF has done for us. And you can see that all these entries are expressed as T, that is trillions of dollars. So when we first look at this data, we might say it seems to be favoring the affirmative. And by the way, one more thing about primary sources. Primary sources is just raw information. It's without interpretation. Now, I'm going to apply interpretation to the data in a minute. I'm going to make connections between different raw data. And then can the other side offset that? Can it counter it with its connections? And I'll do that for you in this exercise. So primary sources could be the data like we see here. It could be quantitative data. It could be testimony. It could be a speech. It could be actions that a particular agency or actor takes. Maybe a country, a leader, a section of a country, a certain type of people. So let's turn back to this data. So as I say, I think when you take a first look at this, you can see where the affirmative can argue in its favor with the data. So here I have expressed the EU, and we see that it's 450 million people, and it has a PPP of 29 trillions of dollars. Now compare that to the United States. You see it's, what, a third more populous, the EU is, relative to the US, and its economic strength is comparable. And take a look at Red China. Oh my goodness, Red China's PPP, its economic strength as measured by that indicator, is superior even to the United States, 4-3 advantage. But still, the European Union is comparable to Red China. So if the United Kingdom wants to have a greater say in world affairs, the affirmative can argue, well, join the European Union. Then we'll have even more economic strength. What will go up, here's the UK's situation, about 70 million people, and almost 4.5 trillions of dollars expressed by PPP. So if we join the UK to the EU, we see that the EU now is pushing 35 trillion, even greater, that much greater than the United States, and pulling closer to Red China's strength. And so wouldn't the UK want to be part of that strong neighborly territory, coalition? You would think so. And let's take another look at this. So what I'm going to do now, let me erase these entries. I'm going to show you something else that would seem to favor the affirmative, but that we're beginning to see a possible counter by the negative. Let's take a look at some of the most important countries within the European Union. And the most important, in terms of economic strength, has to be Germany. You see it has a population a little bigger than the UK. France is very important too. And the UK. Interesting that all these three countries, and these would be the richest, most powerful countries within Europe, not counting Russia, all these countries have roughly similar populations, and their PPPs are remarkably similar. But right now, the UK is not part of the European Union. Well, now let's compare UK, Germany, France for a moment to Poland, which is sort of a medium-sized country within the European Union. Here you see that the UK's economic strength is more than twice as strong as Poland's. Where I'm going with this is that when you look at the membership of the European Union, what's presently 27 countries, you see that the two strongest, Germany and France, are similar, economically speaking, in the aggregate measurement, as is the UK. So if the UK comes into the European Union, its voice is going to be heard. It's going to be one of the three greatest countries, strongest countries within the European Union. In other words, it's forming something of a triumvirate within the European Union. That would seem to favor the affirmative in this debate. So now we've made two arguments using raw data whereby the affirmative has got an advantage in this debate. But just a minute now. Can the negative offset? I think it can, and in fact, I think it can pull ahead. Let's show you how that might work. So let me erase this. Now, the first thing to notice, you say, oh, the UK will have a greater voice in European Union affairs. Well, but think about that now. One country coming in, and there's already 27 countries there. Maybe this European Union is not such a union that's headed toward disunion, toward fragmentation, to disintegration. After all, the British left. How do we know that the UK left? How do we know that other countries won't pull out? In fact, there's a lot of rumblings going on in the European Union. So why would the UK want to get involved in this? Maybe they might be pulled down by these other countries. So I'm beginning to offset some of the advantages of the affirmative. But let's now see if we can swing it back toward the affirmative again. Well, yes, we can. Let's erase this for a moment. And now let's take a look at the Russo-Ukraine war. So, affirmative will argue UK should come into the European Union. It'll be that much stronger vis-a-vis Russia, and they can settle that war in a satisfactory fashion. Let's take a look at that war for a moment. What do we see? Well, one thing that might jump at us, take a look at Russia. And notice I'm qualifying it. Soviet? Perhaps it's Soviet Russia. still. But let's take a look at the numbers here. So interesting. The Russian Federation has a PPP of 7 trillions, or not quite twice as rich as Germany or the UK or France. Let's compare it to its fellow belligerent, which would be Ukraine, the country it's fighting. Interesting, it has a 10-to-1 advantage vis-a-vis Ukraine. You can see why Ukraine is suffering grievously at the hands of the Russians. But then let's compare the strength of Russia to the European Union. And what do we see there? Remember what we've said before. So the European Union presently, without the UK, is almost, 29 trillion. So this is 4 times stronger vis-a-vis Russia. So if UK will come into the European Union, they'll be even that much stronger, and they can settle this war on satisfactory terms. Let's take a look at Belarus for a minute. Belarus is an ally of Russia in the Russo-Ukraine war. It's a neighbor of both Ukraine and Russia. And what do we see there? Well, their GDP is even half the size of the Ukraine GDP, or I should say PPP. So in other words, it's helping Russia, maybe in terms of offering territory, which Russian forces can swing through and attack Ukraine, but it's not really increasing Russian economic strength very much. So again, at the end of the day, the affirmative will say, let us bring in the UK into the EU and settle this war in a satisfactory fashion. Let us have peace again on our terms. Now, the negative will then begin to counter and say, well, just a moment. Of course, this isn't we're not pulling primary sources from the chart, but I'm pulling from another, in a sense, primary source. I'm pulling from a fact. The negative can say, well, isn't the UK already a member of NATO? Isn't it a member of this military alliance? And in fact, as a member of that military alliance, can it not invoke the US at 30 trillion and the EU at approximately 30 trillion, and has now what? An 8-to-1, maybe even a 9-to-1 advantage in economic strength vis-a-vis Russia. But just a moment. Just think about what you said. I just said to you that the European Union on its own is at least 4 times stronger economically speaking than Russia is, as measured by PPP. And if I bring in the United States, the advantage tilts almost 9-to-1 in favor of NATO. So why does the UK have to come into the European Union? Why can't it just stay in the NATO? But this opens up something entirely new, an entirely new front that the negative can exploit, which is to say, who cares what's going on in that part of Europe outside the European Union? Does it really matter? You know, we hear all this talk about Russia being the aggressor, and it's not just the beginnings. This is Munich, that if we allow some kind of settlement, if Zelensky bows to Putin of Russia, that this is the beginnings of the end, the dominoes will fall. It's just like how Hitler is snatching up Austria, Czechoslovakia. Look what will come next. Poland and France and the whole of the European Union will fall at the feet of the bear. Is that what will happen? I just said a moment ago that the European Union on its own has a 4-to-1 advantage over Russia. Add the UK, it's even greater. It's almost a 5-to-1 advantage. Bring in the United States, bring in all of NATO, and the contest isn't even at all. Russia's not conquering anyone. Maybe they can poach off, they can eat like eating off pieces of an onion. They can eat off some of the Ukraine, but so what? They don't threaten Europe as a whole. They don't threaten the European Union. This is peripheral. And yet you forces in EU, in the United States, those forces in the UK that want to get into that war, get in deeper, keep insisting we've got to protect Europe from the bear. Really. And take another look at this situation. In your efforts to rescue Zelensky from Russia, what are you doing to yourself? So remember that chart that I showed you before, the chart of the G7 and the BRICS countries, where the BRICS are ascending in economic strength and the G7 is declining. Remember that they're now at an inflection point. They've intersected. From now on, if things continue, the BRICS will pull away vis-a-vis the G7. Why is that happening? Why is the BRICS getting stronger? And the G7, which would include what? That would include the UK and Germany and France and the US. So 4 of the 7 members of the G7. Japan would be another, Italy. Why is the BRICS pulling away? Well, here's a good reason why. Because in NATO's efforts, especially American-led efforts to defeat Russia, it's harming itself. Why? Look at India. Let's drop down to India for a moment. Look at their purchasing power parity at almost $18 trillion, 2/3 of the United States. You're sanctioning India because India will not do what you want to do vis-a-vis Russia. You're sanctioning Russia, not just Russia, but Russia's trading partners, some of its allies. And what are you getting from it? Are you hurting Russia? No, you're hurting yourself. This is a very powerful argument that the negative can use. Do you understand that, in other words, the negative can argue, regardless of whether Russia is the aggressor or not, Russia isn't going anywhere. This is a sideshow. This doesn't matter. But we're destroying ourselves, and that does matter, and that does hurt world peace. Now, if Russia is not the aggressor, my God, the argument the negative can bear is all the greater. Who's the tyrant here? Who's the bully? Is Ukraine responsible for the Russo-Ukraine war? You wouldn't think so, right? Look at, they have 1/10 the economic strength of Russia. So then how could Ukraine possibly be provocative? Well, maybe because Ukraine has been expanding eastward toward Russia. Maybe because Ukraine has been pursuing an agenda which is very confrontational, very adversarial in the context of its relations with Russia. In any case, when you're all done with these primary sources, you see how I've used the data to some extent to help the affirmative and to some extent to help the negative. But when you pull back further and look at everything, you begin to wonder, just based on this data, economic data, and based on a few other things, rudimentary things we know about the world, you begin to wonder who's got the advantage in this debate. I think it's the negative. Let's go further. So now in this slide, you see a picture. This is a gathering of European diplomats at the signing of the Treaty of Lisbon, at Lisbon, Portugal. This treaty was signed in 2007. And I offer this slide to let you know that there are primary sources supporting this overarching argument that the European Union is the enemy of its member states. In other words, there are primary sources, there are arguments, as we're going to now hear in the next few slides, favoring the populist view. And yet even these primary sources can be countered by the affirmative if you're on your toes. At least to some degree they can be countered. So here in 2007, what's this about? Well, the European Union is trying to come together with a constitution, like the U.S. Constitution. It's not an easy task. You have all these member countries, 27, 28 members of the European Union. So finally, they try to hammer out a very fundamental document. They're calling it the Treaty of Lisbon. And there's something rotten here. At least one can argue there seems to be something rotten. Why? Because if you read the Treaty of Lisbon, so here's a primary source. You should read it yourself. Don't go off of what secondary sources tell you about the treaty. They may not even talk about it. If you take a look at it, you'll see there is no explicit reference to Europe's Christian roots. That's shocking. Instead, there is Freemason language. Equally shocking. So that's odd, isn't it? What's going on here? Maybe Christianity is passé, but even if it's passé, this is the cradle in which Europe was born. And some would argue Christianity is very much alive. Russia, by the way, Putin says it is, ironically that, and he chides European and the European Union for moving away from its Christian roots. Remember, Russia is a Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church country. If we compare the Treaty of Lisbon to the declaration of the several states, the 13 colonies now become independent countries in North America, we see a shocking difference. So I bring this up by way of comparison. Get those primary sources. Take a look at what the several states said about themselves, what the state constitution said in 1776. This is before the United States that we now know is coming into existence. Of course, that takes us to 1789. We're talking about 1776. So take a look at, say, Massachusetts. What you're going to find is, or Pennsylvania or Virginia. So you have these 13 British colonies. They've become independent circa 1776, and all but one of them, Rhode Island is the only exception, all but one of them in their state constitutions invoke explicitly in writing the Trinitarian God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That's a Christian reference through and through in their state constitutions. Here we have the Treaty of Lisbon making no reference whatsoever to a Trinitarian God, to Christ, of anything about Christianity, instead using Masonic language. Is this a good development or a bad development? Now, I think the negative can argue that this is a very bad development, but you still need much more context. This should get you suspicious. There's something wrong. Something evil lurks in the European Union. What could that be? So we're talking about deep causation now. So let's turn to the next slide. Here you see two images side by side. And then I've got some notes underneath these images. Well, I need to draw you a third image, or provide you with a third image. I'm going to do it by hand, and the reason I'm doing it by hand is because the image I'd like to show you is copyrighted, so I dare not share that with you. I'm going to have you take a look at this image. Now, where I want you to go, it's an important thing to do, good exercise, go find the Council of Europe's image representing itself, what it thinks of itself. This is a painting, or I guess maybe it was graphic art, that the Council of Europe commissioned back in 1993, in the early 90s. Remember, the Council of Europe is part of the European Union. This is the circle of leaders, elected leaders of all the countries that are part of the European Union. So I'm going to draw this third image, so please excuse my artistic limitations. And I'm going to begin by putting in 13 stars. Now, I may not bother putting all 13 here. This is rather tedious to do all these stars. And I'm not even able to show you the details that I want you to see in these stars, but I'm going to put down just 7. But understand that in reality, there are 13 stars in this rendering of the Council of Europe, how it's trying to represent not just itself, I should say, but also the European Union. So this rendering is really about ultimately the European Union. Now, remember in the previous slide, we saw the Treaty of Lisbon. We saw that picture of the diplomats gathering at the time that the Treaty of Lisbon was signed in 2007. Remember, there was the blue flag with the 13 stars. Why 13 stars? Well, that's because if we go back to 1992 at the Treaty of European Union, or what is also called the Maastricht Treaty, that's what it's called now, that there were then 12 countries that came together, and I guess the 13th star represents the N+1, the next member to join, or in other words, that the European Union is open-minded or wanting to bring in more. It's not limiting itself to just 12. It's not a closed club, but an open club in a sense. So if I'm being accurate, this third image that I want you to see actually has 13 stars. In fact, I need to make some more room for myself here. You should have 13 stars, and they go down further down here and so forth. Now, what is in the middle of this? What is in the middle of it, I'm just going to represent, well, I'm going to do something, again, very limited. It's a tower. So let's stop for a moment here now. Remember, this image I've just done by hand, crude as it may be, is a representation of the Council of Europe's representation of itself and ultimately of the European Union, formed in 1992. Now, there are 3 on this slide right now. There are 3 towers, aren't there? There's this thing, whatever this thing is over here on the left, which I'll get to in a moment. Then we have this tower over here, and we have this tower here. I'm not going to, let me use my pointer. That's not coming out very well. This third tower here. So let's go back to this first tower. This is actually an actual photograph, you can tell. It's an actual photograph of a building. What building? It's the central building of the European Parliament. That is to say, the European Union's Parliament in Brussels. Now, you notice it's a peculiar looking edifice, isn't it? It seems to have something missing. Let's take a look at this tower. Do you see how there's something missing here too? Now, this third image, which I've crudely represented, also has something missing. In fact, maybe what I need to do is just carve out a little piece of it. Let me just carve this out right here. Whoop, now we lost everything, didn't we? I didn't want that to happen. So I'm going to come here and come here and over here and up here. So it's like a mouse ate a piece of it. Something is missing. Well, what is this image on the right, the top right corner? Well, that is a artist's rendering of the Tower of Babel, the biblical Tower of Babel. And what was the Tower of Babel about? Old Testament times. These are essentially mankind at the time defying God, trying to build a structure that would reach to the heavens, that would be taller than God. They were trying to defy him, to match him, if not even to replace him. Nimrod was behind this endeavor. Well, we know what God thought of that. He comes down and he crushes it, and he scatters these people. They all spoke one tongue, but after he intervenes, God intervenes, they speak many tongues. And that is the biblical account of how we've ended up with so many tongues, so many languages. So anyway, you have these three images. You see they all represent towers, and each of these images has a part of its structure missing, as if it's yet to be built. Something's being built. And that's the idea here between the Tower of Babel. That's the idea of the European Parliament. We're going to bring in more members, and that's the idea that I'm trying to crudely represent here with this little sketch. There is this difference, though, between this image on the top left corner, the image in the top right corner, and the image down in the bottom right corner. What is that? Well, this image down here, the rendering of the European Union, happens to have this little structure here, which looks to me like a crane. And that's what they tell you it is. It's a crane that they've added to their tower to represent adding on more countries, so they claim. And that crane, by the way, they say is pointed eastward, toward Eastern Europe. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? After all, the European Union has, by and large, been expanding eastward. You see, there is no crane in the Tower of Babel. And this allows the Council of Europe, in fact, the European Union, to say, you see, there's nothing to do between our building in Brussels, our parliamentary building, and this modern artist rendering of what we're about, the EU project is about. It's nothing to do with the Tower of Babel. Because believe me, as soon as in 1993, the Council of Europe came out with their image, people began to say, my God, this is demonic. This is against Christ, against God. Why are you choosing this defiant representation of yourself? And they say it isn't. You see, we have a debate going on. But just a moment here. Let's take a closer look, though, at the European Union's representation of itself, and look at the Tower of Babel as an artist rendered. So this artist, by the way, this is a fellow by the name of Pieter Bruegel, and he does his painting in 1563. So he's a medieval artist. Now let me come back to the modern artist rendering of the European Union as commissioned by the European Union. Remember I told you about these 13 stars. Well, there's no 13 stars you see in the image in the top right corner, nor is there any 13 star in the building in the top left corner, but there is in their rendering. What are the 13 stars about? Well, I told you already what they were about, or did I? There's more to it, perhaps. These are peculiar stars. They don't just ring round this modern tower like a halo. I'm choosing that word deliberately, this religious symbol, this halo. They're upside down stars. Come again. Yes, they are. They're upside down. What does that signify? Well, I can tell you one thing, that the Masons and other occultic movements talk about backwards. They talk about inversions, reverses, flipping things. That front is back and black is white and white is black and so forth. And so these stars flipped over. This is an occultic illusion, or could be. Is that significant? It just might be. Remember the Treaty of Lisbon, a slide we saw just a moment ago, that the treaty's language is written in what looks to be a Freemason language. No explicit reference to Christianity or Judeo-Christianity for that matter. No reference whatsoever. So that's disturbing. Let's look a little closer though. If you look at the medieval artist's rendering of his tower, and I'm going to take you now to the bottom left-hand corner, you're going to see that there are realistic representations of human beings wandering around at the foot of the Tower of Babel. Well, if you look at the representation of the European Union as done in the early 1990s, you'll see down here in the corner there are again a representation of people, but it's a very approximate representation. These are heads and bodies, torsos that are squares, rectangles. There's nothing pleasing or realistic about it. And you get the impression as if that these people can be fit together just like jigsaw puzzle like, or Lego, that they don't have a life of their own, thoughts of their own. That's not the representation, that's not the representation that presented in Peter Bruegel's painting, but that's the representation in the 1993 rendering of the European Union. What else is going on here? All right, so now I'm going to draw your attention to this official inscription. In the bottom right corner of the 1993 representation of the European Union, there's a little square, and that square contains this inscription: Europe, many tongues, one voice. You see that in the case of Peter Bruegel's medieval representation, there is nothing in the top right, bottom right-hand corner, except it looks like a river or a sea. There's nothing there. But there very much so is in this 1993 representation of the European Union. By the way, there's nothing down here, I don't believe, at the base of the building that would tell us the intent being signaled by the construction of the buildings. I don't think there is. I don't remember seeing anything there. So what about this? Well, remember we talked about the Tower of Babel, that is, people spoke in those days, according to the Old Testament account, one language. They had one tongue, in other words, and God scattered them. He not only destroyed the building, but he scattered them so they now speak many languages, hence the many languages we speak today, or the beginnings of that proliferation of languages. Well, here you're going from many tongues to one voice. It's like you're reversing, some would say, what God has done. You're back on the path of defiance. Is there another possible inspiration for all this? Well, perhaps. And what might that be? And here I'm giving you a quote from Hitler, 1938, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. Is this the European Union's subtle attempt to strike that kind of chord? No pun intended. Now, what about this slide? And what about the previous slide? Could you use this in debate? Yes, you could. Would it have a great impact? Hardly. It can be easily offset, and it would take a long time to make the case. Look how many minutes I've just used in this video to tell you about these and to compare these and to contrast these three images. But sometimes, though, and this is evidence, this is definitely evidence, sometimes evidence may not be usable in debate, or at least in a way you can't think of it being usable, but it can open your mind and can lead you to other evidence that could be used in debate. And I suggest to you, if you look at this slide and the previous slide, it's beginning to look as if there's something rotten about the European Union, and that rot goes a way back. What, in 2007, when they were trying to establish a constitution, back to 1992, when they actually formally formed what we now call the European Union. Could it go back even further? It just might. Which takes me now to the next slide. We've seen this map before. We saw it earlier in this video. I'm bringing it back again because I want to drive home now the possibility, the very distinct possibility, that the European Union is not what it says it is. We saw something troubling in the Treaty of Lisbon. At least I think it's troubling. We saw something troubling with this Council of Europe's rendering of itself. Now let's go closer to the root of the matter. Where did the European Union come from? Remember that chronology I offered you, starting in 1942 and coming up to the present time. And remember the citations 1942, 1989. What's going on here? Well, back in 1942, as I said before, the Nazis were looking ahead. They weren't sure they were going to win the war. As we get into 1943, 44, 45, they realize they're going to lose the war militarily, that the German state's going to be defeated, probably overrun. But the party wants to live on. So they begin to create a mechanism, this has all been recorded, to revitalize the project. The project that they declare stretches from Atlantic, which would be anything here, all the way to the Urals, all the way here. They call it Atlantic to the Urals. And how are they going to do that? They're going to, this is the Nazis talking, actual documentation, 1942 through 45. They're going to create, they're going to revisit this empire of theirs, but in a new form. They're going to create a union of Europe. There's going to be a common currency. There's going to be leadership from the very top by unelected officials. And of course, Hitler, he gets elected, but from that time on, he's nothing but the whole government from that time on is essentially unelected. It's a dictatorship. They're going to have common agricultural policy, trade policies, military policies. They're going to integrate Europe, but what? From a German point of view, or what we would call a pan-German perspective. They're going to submerge all the other states in this future union to Germany. Sovereignty, nation-state system is going to be removed gradually, but the German state will remain. So it's a new way to revive the Nazi project, if you will. And they actually begin this process. And so what happens is, in 1943, 44, we have newspaper reports, American reports, other newspapermen noticing that a lot of Nazi officials are showing up in Madrid, in Spain. Remember, Franco's Spain is a fascist power. It's not militarily on the side of the Nazis, but it's sympathetic toward the Nazis and toward fascist Italy. And from here, they will plot their return to power. There's a lot more to this argument, but there are strong primary sources indicating that this is what happened. At least this is part of what happened. That the beginnings of the European project, beginning 1945, had Nazi roots, or at least the Nazis were part of it. They tried to make themselves into the yeast of this rising bread. Now, let's take a look at the Soviet Union. I mentioned something about the Soviets, didn't I, in that chronology back in the early part of the video. So let me erase this for a moment. Now, what's going on there? Well, the West, the conventional view, in fact, is a very commonplace view, is that the Soviet Union collapsed of its own weight. Reagan had a lot to do with that. He began to increase and this is a fact, the U.S. defense budget increased in the 1980s. The Soviets just could not keep up, and the empire just collapsed. It was an inefficient economy. The West won. Capitalism won. We all believe that. We've all congratulated ourselves. But there's another possibility, and there are primary sources that say this is not what happened. There is strong evidence that tells us, on the contrary, yes, the Soviet Union was defeated, but not the Communist Party, the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was not defeated, that it lived on. That, in other words, the parasite, the CPSU, outlived the host, the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union becomes the Russian Federation, and the Soviet Union breaks up into various parts. So you have Ukraine down here, and you have Belarus, here's the Russian Federation, you have other parts of it. But there is evidence arguing that, in fact, this dismantle was a deliberate dismantlement. So what's the idea here? That the Communist Party of the Soviet Union will remove the image of the enemy, that the West seeing the Soviets as the enemy. They'll remove that image, but the enemy remains. And what will they do? They will infiltrate Europe and America, and anywhere else for that matter. In other words, the world revolution will continue. There are primary sources indicating this. There are things happening on the grounds suggesting this. And yet we say this is poppycock. This didn't happen. Don't be so sure. Now, when we talk about this continuing Soviet Communist Party project, what do they talk about? Remember, the Nazis talk about a project from the Atlantic to the Urals. Well, the Soviets talk about a project from the Atlantic to beyond this map to the Vladivostok. Vladivostok is a seaport of Russia near Japan. It's really Eurasia. So you have this two visions, this Soviet Party vision, Communist Party of the Soviet Union vision, and then you have the Nazi vision, which is a subset in a sense. Yet remember also, Nazism is National Socialism. Communism is international socialism. So there is something similar, there's something dissimilar, and yet they have things in common. So you could have the Nazi yeast part of this European Union project growing, and then you have this addition as of 1989 coming from the East, and they're more or less getting along, though there'll be points of friction. This could be what happened. This could be the origins of the European Union, a Nazi origin, or at least a strong Nazi influence at the beginning, with an add-on later from the CPSU. It's very possible. And what is the upshot of this? A very rotten creation indeed. Now, I gave you some indications already about the rottenness. Why this moving away from Christianity? Why this effort to go out of your way to compare your project to the Tower of Babel? I know that some will say that's not what they're doing, but the evidence is pretty strong, as I just presented in the previous slide, that this is exactly what they intended. Where is this coming from? This anti-Christian, anti-European, really, anti-nation state view, anti-populist view, globalist view. Where's it coming from? Out of nowhere? There is evidence to show that the leadership of the European Union has communist and even Nazi influence. And that would account for the oddness, I would say even bizarreness. That accounts for European farmers dumping manure by the ton on European Union buildings. Something is really amiss here. Open your eyes. Something is missing, the negative can say to the affirmative. Something's missing. And yet, can you use this evidence in debate, or does it help you understand the world? Well, sometimes you need to understand the world to be able to deal with your own prejudices, because we've grown up believing that the Soviets were defeated, the West won, it's all over now. But in the CPSU in 1989, now who knows exactly, but it's been estimated that there were 20 million members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That's about 10% of the Soviet population. Do you think they simply just became all Democrats? Is that what they want us to believe? Well, that's what they want us to believe, according to this discussion, this argument, that it was strategy, a stratagem to remove the image of the enemy, but keep while the enemy continued, and to move away from the overt expansion, which, by the way, in the communist thinking, and again, this is all documented, they have a Stalinist model and a Leninist model. And in the Stalinist model, you operate from the basis that of a nation state or empire, and it's military, economic, political. The Leninist model is it's a revolutionary party. It's the parasites moving about the hosts of the world. So they can revert. They started as a Leninist model. It was Lenin and his party which seized power in Russia, then became a Stalinist model, and then they shed that and reverted back to their Leninist model. So this Leninist model, along with the Nazi International, more or less getting along, sometimes friction, may have been behind a lot of the concept, a lot of the idea of the European Union. It's very possible. And that opens your mind that there's something really amiss. But then there's even more amiss here, or even more to see, which I'm not going to get into this video. We're going to offer you, we have evidence package, which will let you plunge in deeper. And this evidence package will contain arguments that you can use, I think, very effectively in debate. It will give you strategic surprise. It will result in you generating powerful cards. But you need to have the background first. Now, before we go any further, I should also say there's very definite, let me give you just a taste of what might be in that evidence package, or something we need to think about. The European Union, remember, is top down. It is led by unelected officials at the top. Very dictatorial, not just authoritarian, dictatorial. And what, again, does that smell of? Nazi and Soviet influences. It's dictatorial, and can we point to it? Well, there's all this hate speech. There's a lot of, the freedom of speech is being eroded in the European Union. You can find evidence to that effect. Farmers are being affected by policy, and freedom of speech is eroding. What about this business about climate, about health? Does that have maybe Nazi or especially Soviet roots? It just might. It just might. At least you could argue that. So now you see we're getting into something substantive that has that you can show real impact in debate, and that we offer you in the evidence packages. So when you're all done, I think this argument tilts toward the negative. Now, I've gone on. This has been a very long classical topic analysis. That's one reason why I have to go to the next stage and provide you an evidence package, which I hope you will acquire. But more importantly, I hope you will come to Statesman Debate Institute and learn the techniques that let you acquire this strategic surprise, which takes me on to the next slide.
This is the third time we've seen this map. And I look at it this third time to draw your attention to the third deficiency that I think I can discern in discussions of the UK-EU debate resolution, topic analyses leaving something to be desired. And this third deficiency deals with banking. So first we need to orient ourselves on the map yet again, and so I want to draw your attention to three cities: London, Frankfurt, Germany, and a third city not in the European Union, and yet I think is significant here, Basel, Switzerland. So here it is on the Rhine, on the northwest corner of Switzerland. Each of these cities is the home of a central bank. Now, what is a central bank? Well, it regulates all the banks in its system. It also can serve as a last resort, that if there is a run on a lesser bank in the system, it can rush capital to that stricken bank and contain the infection, if you will, and prevent the entire banking system from collapsing and dragging the country into depression. So central banks are very important. So here in London, we have the UK central bank, a national central bank. In Frankfurt, Germany, we have the European central bank. That means now that this European, the ECB, the European Central Bank, regulates all the other central banks and their respective banks. So you have 27 member states of the European Union. Each member state has its own central bank. The European Central Bank coordinates them, and in fact, all the other 27 central banks are subordinate to the European Central Bank. This is a very big component of this European Union. So in effect, the ECB sets monetary policy for every member of the European Union, as it did for the UK when the UK was part of the European Union. And what about Basel, Switzerland? Well, this is home to the Bank for International Settlements, which is also known as the BIS. Of these three banks, the BIS is virtually unknown. It keeps itself out of the newspapers. And yet it may have an inordinate influence on everything else monetary-wise, and for that matter, political, economic, military across the globe. Why is that? Well, the Bank for International Settlements is often referred to as the central bank of all central banks worldwide, or of nearly all the central banks worldwide. Now, there's two more cities to point out here in Switzerland. One is Geneva. I'm not actually going to mark it on the map. I'll point to it, though. Let's see if I can get the pointer to work. Here it is on the western side. And Davos on the eastern side of Switzerland. Well, Geneva was the home of the League of Nations between the First and Second World Wars. Davos Well, that's the home of the World Economic Forum, the WEF. If you've heard about global or international banking, you might have heard of the WEF, but not the BIS. And why do I put the WEF in the same breath as banking, global banking in this case? Because there's so much overlap between banking executives and those people who are involved with the WEF. In fact, every year the WEF gathers together hundreds, in fact, even several thousand global elite, including bankers. The WEF, to some say, looks like a debate society, and yet it could be that it's really striking some kind of consensus and setting the agenda for many other countries. Now, let's go further now. How would the affirmative and negative use some of this information? Well, you can see what the affirmative could do just with the definition of a central bank. If a central bank is a regulator of the banking system in a given jurisdiction, and if it's a source of last resort, that would seem to be a good thing. And wouldn't the UK want to benefit from that? Why stand apart? Why just rely upon your national central bank when you could have a continent-wide European central bank to promote your economy and to protect you from crises? Why not? Well, the negative can respond, that's just the point, that the central bank in Europe, the European Central Bank, has too much influence. And that's a good reason why the UK wanted to separate. Can I go deeper with this influence, whether it's good or bad? Well, it turns out that by 2016, more than 80% of all British law was actually law conceived in the European Union. That is supposedly from the European Union Commission. And that 6,000 regulations had also come down from the EU onto England. Well, the negative would say, see, I've told you that. I mean, England's losing itself. It's being submerged by all these laws and regulations coming from the European Union, from the continent of the European Union. Good thing the UK detached. But let's take a closer look, though, at this, would say the affirmative. Turns out that of these 6,000 regulations that you've just mentioned by 2016, 10% of them had been ditched by 2021. That is, by 5 years later, British government had only shed themselves of 10% of these regulations, and most of these regulations were very insignificant. And so the affirmative could say, well, apparently these laws and regulations are a good thing. Otherwise, they would have gotten rid of more than 10% of these regulations and gotten rid of the more significant ones at that. Who could be behind these laws and regulations? Well, we typically think of them being the product of government, of the interaction of legislative and executive branches. But couldn't banking play a role in the conception and implementation of laws and regulations? It's something that needs to be examined. In fact, I think it's so important that I've written a whole book about it. In fact, it's my 7th book, and I wrote 2 other books that deal in part with banking. And while we're on that topic about books about banking, I would argue that banking per se doesn't get enough attention no matter what the debate resolution, yet it may have a huge effect on every single debate resolution that we'll deal with our forensic circuit, and that beyond that, even American education doesn't talk enough about banking when it should. Let me take you to an issue I haven't brought up at all, which is immigration. And let's see what role banking may play on that. It turns out that a lot of immigrants have come into the European Union from North Africa, from the Middle East, mostly Muslim immigrants. And yet almost all these immigrants stayed within the continent of Europe. Remember, they have the freedom to move anywhere they want, but they seem to be staying inside the continent of Europe. In fact, in 2015, Germany brought in 1 million immigrants. And all that time, almost none of them crossed over into the UK. It's rather curious, isn't it? Why not? Why didn't they come over to the UK? It seems like there's some kind of understanding between the UK and the European Union to keep the immigrants out. Who was the one really driving it? Did the bankers have a role in this? And what could that agenda be? And then what happens after Brexit? Well, actually, after Brexit is formally completed in 2021, or fully completed by 2021, Now there's a huge influx of immigrants into the UK, but they're not coming from the European Union. They're coming from outside, around it. What is that about? Again, did banking have a role to play in it? And while we're talking about the role or possible role that the bankers could play in public affairs, what about the origins of the European Union? Now, I suspect, and I've suggested that the Nazi Party and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union may well have had a hand in the origin of the European Union. Where did those two parties come from? The Nazi Party and the CPSU. They homespun. Did one come out of Germany and one come out of Russia? Or were there other forces at play? Did the bankers have a hand in it? These are important questions, and they may well bear upon our debate resolution. Well, let's now take you to the next slide, and let's bring this discussion, this topic analysis, to its head, to a conclusion.
This slide is meant to serve two purposes. I want to pull together what we've been talking about in this debate resolution, the various arguments. And I also want to talk about classical training, the kind of training that Statesman Debate Institute offers you, and our vision of what the forensic circuit could really be doing. So when I think about the forensic circuit and student debate, I think about a mountain, and actually many mountains. So let me explain. Let me first sketch something. So here we have a valley, and then we have a first plateau, and then we have a mountain top soaring above the first plateau. More than 99%, not quite, actually a touch over 99% of all high school students do not engage in formal debate. You're rare. You should be commended. You're that 1% or so that does involve yourself in this very rigorous, very important intellectual activity. You see the value of this. We need more of your peers involved. We need you to persuade them. We need you to launch good arguments to get them to come in with you. But even though you're in that 1%, maybe you could be even experiencing more than you are. There's arguments out there, there's tools out there that you're not aware of. And so that's why Statesman Debate Institute talks about valley dwellers, almost all secondary school students, and then talks about the 1% or so that are first plateau thinkers, and you're benefiting from conventional topic analysis. I mean, it does many good things. I don't want you to think that I don't think it's doing good things. It is, but I think you could be doing even better. You could be coming up to the mountaintop where classical training would take you. And not only that, but think about a debate resolution as scaling a mountain. But every time, and also think about then that every time you engage in a new debate resolution, you're scaling another mountain. And so the more mountains you can get to the top of, the more you can see of the world. That's how we see it at Statesman Debate Institute. So we give you arguments, and we also give you tools. We want you to ultimately to climb to the mountain yourself. Get above that first plateau. Now let's relate this to what we've been talking about in this case with UK should rejoin EU. So I'm suggesting there are three deficiencies in conventional topic analysis, and for that matter probably in the conventional forensic circuit, where this debate resolution is concerned. A lot of good's being done in conventional work, but even better could be done. And it may not be the fault of a particular coach or a student. It's just that we don't know. Now, why don't we know? Well, that's another discussion. We can get into that if we had the time. But what you find is that much of your debate is at this first plateau level. So that let's take the case of climate change. So most of your peers think that global warming is taking place. Maybe it is, but they don't go beyond that. They just take it as a given. But you know better. You're up here and you realize, just a second now, you'll say, maybe global warming is happening, but not as rapidly as some say, or maybe there's another way to do it, or it's not happening. So you're aware that there's another point of view. You may not agree in that point of view, but you're aware of it. That's a step forward. But what if it turns out that climate change has actually been manufactured? The climate change crisis has been manufactured, that it's a hoax, that it's serving a political agenda, or that it's completely batty, that somebody just went out of control, is out of control. What about that possibility?
Or what about the possibility it's even worse than we realize, that our leaders, for our own good, are not telling us how bad it really is? What about that possibility? And think about other major issues. That's why we've got to get up to the mountaintop on our own and handle the information for ourselves. Now, I've said in the case of this resolution, EU resolution, I've been saying that there's these three deficiencies. So one deficiency is within the evidence or within the arguments that we typically talk about. So when something comes up like climate change, we're aware that there are some counter arguments. But I call that awareness, the typical awareness you encounter in the forensic circuit, arguing at the margin. You're still operating within what I would call a globalist perspective. It might be correct, this globalist perspective, but I think it's weak. It doesn't have the range of the knowledge behind it that it should. It's missing that populist approach that says this globalist position is nonsense altogether. And they're not just saying this because they're knee-jerk reaction, though some people are strictly reactionary. If you really get to the root of it, the populist position is grounded in facts, in strong evidence. And you need to be aware of both. But let's go a little bit further. I said another deficiency in conventional topic analysis that I've been seeing is it's not talking correctly or enough about the origin of the EU. We just take the origin of the EU for granted. We say, all right, let's start looking at Brexit. Let's go back to 2016. Maybe we can go back to 1992, but we don't need to go back before anything before that. Just let's take a look at what's going on in the here and now, not worry about the past. It's not relevant. It is relevant, I would argue. The origin of the EU could be very relevant. Let's go further. And this is something we didn't do much of at all, except in the previous slide, which is not talking about money, banking, the money power. What about that element? That's very important, but it's rarely ever brought into our debate. It's rarely ever brought into education. It rarely comes up in any circles, frankly. Even national level leaders, top media commentators rarely bring it up. At least don't bring up the nuts and bolts of that. Why? Oh, it's too obtuse. It's not that important for the common man. Or maybe it is very important for the common man. But you need to know. And that's mountaintop information. Now, how does that apply? Let me give you a possibility. Suppose that this negative position is correct, that the origin of the EU is Nazi and Soviet, and still Nazi and Soviet influence to this day. Suppose that's true. Where did the Nazi party come from? Where did the Communist Party come from? Is it spontaneous combustion? Or is there something behind it? So the first thing we hear about is, well, there's capitalism versus communism. So maybe there are arch capitalists who are just obsessed with profit, and maybe there's a need to counter that, and that's where communism came from. The national version and the international versions, Nazi and Soviet versions. Maybe that's the case. Or maybe there's a group above that is manipulating capitalism and manipulating its antithesis, which is communism. Maybe that's what's happening. Maybe this all intersects in banking circles. Maybe there's some good bankers and bad bankers. You see, this is very rarefied indeed. We're going way up, way up. Is it enough to get up to one mountain top to understand what's really driving world affairs, or do you have to get up to many mountains? Probably have to get up to many mountains. Which brings me to this next point, which is, you have to be strategic in your use of information. You only have so much time in this life, and you only have so many months to deal with this particular resolution. If you got started on this resolution as quickly as possible, that was back August 1. You have 3 months, August 1 to November 1 approximately, to get ready for the tournament. Is that enough time? So sometimes you may be aware of information that you could use in debate, could generate some very powerful cards, very powerful arguments, if you only had time to prepare and only had time to speak the words you need to speak in debate. That's the case often. Sometimes there's evidence that you run into, and I referenced this in a previous slide when we talked about the Council of Europe, and that image rendering the Council of Europe being very bizarre illusion or metaphor. Sometimes there's evidence that's circumstantial that you just shouldn't bring up in debate. It can be defeated too easily. It's better spend that precious time on an argument that has a greater impact. So now you begin to realize that when you look at evidence
there's a range here, and some of it is very important but circumstantial, and some of it is just simply circumstantial and not all that interesting. But that the evidence that is very circumstantial, doesn't have a big impact in debate, is worth looking at because it opens your mind. Then you have other arguments, evidence, that you can handle. You can master it in the weeks leading up to a tournament and can use it in the few minutes you have in a tournament effectively, have very good impact. And then you have other impacts. So I'm going to try to reinforce this by widening this slant. Then you have other evidence which is very powerful, but you just don't have the resources to bring to bear. This debate resolution, the UK-EU resolution, is one of those rare resolutions that covers so much ground, so much possibility here. So what I'm suggesting to you is you should contact Statesman Debate Institute, especially where this resolution is concerned. Get our evidence package. Acquire strategic surprise. But also, in a sense, grow your library. Be aware of what is out there if you only had time. Introduce yourself to the way things really are in the world. You may find that up here on the mountains, or when you get up to multiple mountains, as I think we have at Statesman Debate Institute, I think you may find that it's an interesting debate going on, that there are elite that, and I think they're involved with the banking industry, that may be actually doing things for our own good. Maybe philosopher kings, good, benevolent philosopher kings who are tackling terrible, terrible problems and just for our own good don't tell us all about it. Or maybe those same forces are out of control, or there's a faction or factions between them. You need to know this, though, at some point in your career. You need to know if you're going to be an effective leader. You need to involve yourself in that. That's why this resolution should really open minds. And that's why I've been forced to do what I'm doing, which is to say, this is already a long video as it is, to bring this to a close and say, look, we have more information for you. You should acquire it. You should get our evidence package. Better yet, you should actually take our courses, learn the tools we've used to learn about world affairs as they really are. And they're not that difficult to acquire. You're already using some of them. There's some more you could be using, and there is more effective use you can be making of the tools you already have. I commend you for being involved in debate. We need more of your peers involved. I commend your coaches. And by the way, a lot of the information that SDI brings to you, we learned the hard way, or we thought one thing, we learned more, and we changed our mind. We continued to debate among ourselves. That's a mark of a good educator. It's a mark of a good citizen and a good leader, to keep your mind open to possibilities. So in this next slide, I'm going to show you what SDI specifically offers vis-a-vis this particular debate resolution and what it offers long term. If you'd like to be trained in the classical method, attain the mountaintop view that I spoke of a moment ago, secure for your team a strategic advantage and the element of surprise in debate, then click the link in the description box of this video. Click that link and it will take you to our catalog of programs. Here on the left side of this slide, you can see a partial snapshot of this catalog. You can also get to the catalog by following or using the URL that is placed on the right side of this slide, cfar21.org/SDI programs. Once you get to that catalog, you will see that we provide a very wide range of support. Most of that support not found elsewhere, I suggest. We offer coaching and evidence packages, in particular for this UK-EU debate resolution. We offer seminars for other debate coaches and other social science teachers. Tell your teachers about what we have to offer. We support a wide range of debate formats. We provide a library of books that will help you in debate for the rest of your academic career and the rest of your life. We provide training at the novice, intermediate, advanced, and varsity levels. Look at this thing we call strategic knowledge. We offer our own government simulations. They're patterned after the methodology of the Roman elite, what they did to train their youth.
If you like to wrestle with actual burning issues, if you like to tackle primary sources, do exactly what top leaders do, you'll love then these simulations. We offer AP History coaching and we offer thesis mentoring. Take a look at this catalog, and there you can see where you can find it at cfar21.org/SDI programs. I think you'll like what you'll see, and I hope to see you down the road.